For 30 seconds, Madison Square Garden was in complete chaos. An angry critic was trying to attack Eric Clapton on stage. Then Clapton said 4 words that changed everything. It was March 15, 1985, and Eric Clapton was at the height of his solo career. The Behind the Sun tour had been selling out arenas across America, and tonight's show at Madison Square Garden was the crown jewel of the entire tour. All 18,000 seats were filled, and the energy in the venue was electric. But what none of the fans knew was that sitting in the VIP section, directly in front of the stage, was Robert Hayes, the most feared music critic in America. Hayes wrote for Rolling Stone, the New York Times, and had a syndicated radio show that reached millions. His reviews could make or break careers, and he was notorious for his brutal honesty and personal attacks on musicians he deemed unworthy of success. Hayes had been gunning for Eric Clapton for years. In his opinion, Clapton was nothing more than a derivative blues guitarist who had stolen his sound from Black American musicians and profited from it without giving proper credit. He'd written scathing reviews of Clapton's albums, calling him a competent player with no original voice and the most overrated guitarist in rock history. But Hayes had never seen Clapton perform live, and his editor at Rolling Stone had challenged him to attend a concert before writing another negative review. You can't fairly critique someone's artistry without witnessing their live performance, his editor had said. Go see him play, then tell me he's overrated. So Hayes had accepted the challenge, but he'd already made up his mind. He was planning to write the most devastating concert review of his career, one that would finally expose Eric Clapton as the fraud Hayes believed him to be. The concert had started brilliantly. Clapton opened with Motherless Children, his guitar work crisp and emotional. The crowd was immediately captivated, and even Hayes had to admit that Clapton's stage presence was commanding. But Hayes was looking for flaws, taking notes on every missed note, every moment where Clapton's voice cracked, every guitar lick that sounded too similar to something B.B. King or Muddy Waters might have played. As the show progressed through I Shot the Sheriff, Lay Down Sally, and Cocaine, something unexpected began happening to Hayes. Despite his preconceptions and his determination to hate the performance, he found himself getting caught up in the music. Clapton's guitar work was more nuanced and sophisticated than Hayes had expected from listening to the studio albums. His interaction with the crowd was genuine and warm, without the arrogance Hayes had anticipated. By the time Clapton launched into Lila, Hayes was struggling with a realization that went against everything he'd written about this musician for the past 5 years. Eric Clapton wasn't just competent, he was exceptional. The way he bent notes, the emotion he conveyed through his guitar, the way he made 18,000 people feel like he was playing just for them. It was everything Hayes claimed to value in live performance. But Hayes had built his reputation on being the critic who wasn't fooled by popular opinion. He'd made a career out of taking down sacred cows, and Eric Clapton was one of the biggest sacred cows in rock music. Even as he watched Clapton deliver a masterful performance, Hayes felt his professional identity being challenged. The internal conflict came to a head during Wonderful Tonight. As Clapton played the gentle, romantic ballad with incredible tenderness, Hayes saw couples in the audience holding hands, people swaying together, genuine emotion throughout the venue. It was exactly the kind of moment that Hayes had always dismissed as manufactured sentimentality. But he couldn't deny what he was witnessing. This wasn't manufactured. This was real connection between artist and audience, the kind of magic that happens when a great musician is at the top of their game.
Hayes began drinking heavily. The VIP section had complimentary alcohol, and Hayes consumed glass after glass of whiskey, trying to numb the cognitive dissonance he was experiencing. Everything he'd believed about Eric Clapton was being challenged by what he was seeing and hearing. As the alcohol took effect, Hayes became more agitated. He started muttering criticisms loud enough for people around him to hear. "This is derivative," he said during Bell Bottom Blues. "He's just copying the masters." During Crossroads, he announced to nobody in particular, "Robert Johnson did it better." The people seated near Hayes began to recognize him. Word spread through the VIP section that the infamous music critic was there, drunk and making negative comments about the performance. Some fans began challenging his comments, defending Clapton's artistry. "You wouldn't know good music if it hit you in the face," one fan told Hayes. "I've forgotten more about music than you'll ever know," Hayes shot back, his words slurred from alcohol. The confrontation escalated throughout the evening. Hayes became increasingly belligerent, and his comments became more personal and loud. He wasn't just criticizing the music anymore, he was attacking Clapton's character, his authenticity, and his right to play blues music. "He's a cultural appropriator," Hayes shouted during Have You Ever Loved a Woman? "He's stealing black music and getting rich off it." By this point, several audience members in the VIP section were openly arguing with Hayes. The disruption was becoming noticeable, and security personnel were keeping an eye on the situation. But Hayes was beyond caring about social niceties or venue etiquette. Years of professional frustration, combined with alcohol and the uncomfortable realization that he might have been wrong about Clapton, had created a perfect storm of irrational behavior. As Clapton began his final song of the evening, Cocaine, Hayes reached his breaking point. Standing up unsteadily, he cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Clapton, you're a fraud! You're the most overrated musician in history!" The shout was loud enough to carry across the venue. People throughout Madison Square Garden turned to locate the source of the disruption. Even Clapton heard it, though he continued playing without missing a beat. But Hayes wasn't finished. Emboldened by what he perceived as a lack of response, he shouted again, "You're not worthy of playing blues music. You're nothing but a copycat." This time, Clapton did react. He looked in Hayes's direction, but continued playing. The crowd began booing Hayes, and security started moving toward the VIP section. But Hayes had gone too far to stop now. In a moment of alcohol-fueled recklessness that would define the rest of his career, he decided to take his confrontation directly to the stage. Hayes pushed past the people in his row and ran toward the front of the venue. Security tried to intercept him, but he was surprisingly quick for a drunk man. He reached the edge of the stage and began climbing up, shouting the entire time, "Face me, Clapton! Defend your music! Prove you're not a fraud!" For 30 seconds, Madison Square Garden was in complete chaos. Security was trying to grab Hayes as he scrambled onto the stage. The audience was on their feet, some booing Hayes, others shocked by the unprecedented disruption. Clapton's band had stopped playing, unsure how to respond to this bizarre situation. Hayes made it fully onto the stage, standing about 10 feet away from Eric Clapton. He was swaying from alcohol, pointing accusingly at the musician, his face red with anger and embarrassment.
"There he is!" Hayes shouted, addressing the crowd as much as Clapton. "Your guitar god! Let's see how good he really is when he's challenged!" The security team was closing in, and it looked like Hayes was about to be forcibly removed from the stage. The crowd was growing more hostile toward the critic, and the situation seemed on the verge of becoming dangerous. That's when Eric Clapton did something that nobody in Madison Square Garden expected. He walked calmly over to Robert Hayes, looked him directly in the eyes, and said 4 words that could be heard clearly through the sound system. "Let him stay up." The arena went dead silent. Security stopped moving toward Hayes. The crowd stopped booing. Even Hayes himself seemed shocked by Clapton's response. Clapton turned to address the audience, speaking into his microphone with a calm, measured voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Robert Hayes. He's a music critic, and he's been writing about me for years. Tonight, he's going to get the chance to say everything he wants to say, right here, right now." Clapton then did something even more unexpected. He took off his guitar and handed it to Hayes. "Here," Clapton said, "if you think you can do better, show us." The crowd was stunned. Hayes stood holding Clapton's famous Fender Stratocaster, the instrument that had created some of rock music's most memorable moments. He looked around at 18,000 faces staring at him, all waiting to see what he would do. Hayes had spent his entire career analyzing music, critiquing performances, and telling musicians how they should improve their craft, but he had never been asked to demonstrate his own musical abilities in front of an audience. "I don't play guitar," Hayes admitted, his voice much quieter now. "Then how do you know so much about how it should be played?" Clapton asked, not unkindly, but firmly. The question hung in the air. Hayes looked around the arena, suddenly very aware of where he was and what he had done. The alcohol was still affecting his judgment, but the reality of his situation was beginning to sink in. "I study music," Hayes said, trying to maintain some dignity. "I understand theory, composition, historical context." "That's valuable," Clapton replied. "But do you understand feeling? Do you understand what it's like to stand in front of people and try to move them with just 6 strings in your voice?" Hayes had no answer. He stood there holding the guitar, feeling its weight, understanding perhaps for the first time that there was a difference between analyzing music and creating it. Clapton continued, his voice carrying clearly throughout the silent arena. "Mr. Hayes has written that I'm overrated, that I don't deserve the success I've had, that I'm stealing from the blues masters who came before me. Maybe he's right. Maybe I don't deserve to be up here." The crowd began to murmur, but Clapton raised his hand for silence. "But here's what I know. Every night, I get up on stage and I try to honor the musicians who taught me. B.B. King, Muddy Waters, Robert Johnson, Freddie King. They're the real masters. I'm just trying to keep their music alive and share it with people who might not otherwise hear it." Clapton walked closer to Hayes, speaking directly to him, but still using the microphone so everyone could hear. "You're right that I learned from black musicians. You're right that I owe everything to the blues masters, but I've never pretended otherwise. Every interview, every album credit, every chance I get, I talk about where this music comes from and who taught it to me." Hayes was beginning to look uncomfortable. The righteous anger that had fueled his stage invasion was fading, replaced by a growing awareness that he had made a serious mistake. "The question isn't whether I'm worthy of playing this music," Clapton continued. "The question is whether I'm honoring it, and that's something only the music itself can answer." Clapton gently took his guitar back from Hayes and strapped it on. "Mr. Hayes, you're welcome to stay up here while I play. Listen not as a critic, but as someone who loves music. Then tell me if what you hear is honest or not." What happened next became one of the most legendary performances in rock history. With Robert Hayes standing awkwardly beside him on stage, Eric Clapton began playing "The Sky is Crying," a slow, mournful blues number originally recorded by Elmore James. But Clapton didn't play it as a show-off piece or a technical demonstration. He played it as a prayer, as a tribute, as a conversation with the ghosts of every blues musician who had ever poured their heart into a guitar. The performance was raw, emotional, and authentic in a way that even Hayes couldn't deny. As Clapton played, Hayes could see tears in the audience. He could feel the power of the music himself, the way it seemed to speak directly to something deep inside every person in the arena. When the song ended, the applause was different from typical concert cheering. It was respectful, almost reverent. People understood they had witnessed something special. Clapton turned to Hayes and asked, "What did you hear?" Hayes stood in silence for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his words were barely audible, but the microphones picked them up. "I heard the truth." Clapton nodded and then addressed the audience one final time. "Thank you for letting Mr. Hayes and me work through this together. Sometimes the best criticism comes from understanding, not from distance." Hayes walked off stage without saying another word. Security escorted him out of the venue, but gently now, without the force that had seemed imminent earlier. The concert ended with Clapton playing "Amazing Grace," a song that felt like a benediction and a peace offering. Robert Hayes never wrote another negative review of Eric Clapton. In fact, 3 weeks later, he published a column titled "The Night I Learned the Difference Between Criticism and Understanding." In it, he wrote,
I thought I knew everything about music because I could analyze it, categorize it, and compare it to historical precedents. But until I stood on that stage with Eric Clapton, I didn't understand that music isn't about perfection or originality. It's about honesty, vulnerability, and the courage to share your deepest feelings with strangers. The article became one of the most widely read pieces Hayes ever wrote. It marked a turning point in his career as he began focusing less on tearing down artists and more on helping readers understand why certain performances moved them. Hayes and Clapton never became friends, but they developed a mutual respect. Years later, Hayes would write that the night at Madison Square Garden taught him more about music than all his years of formal study combined. The bootleg recording of that night, particularly Clapton's performance of "The Sky is Crying" with Hayes on stage, became legendary among fans. It's considered one of the most emotionally powerful performances Clapton ever gave. Today, music critics and performers still reference the Hayes incident as an example of how artists and critics can engage constructively rather than destructively. It proved that even the most hostile criticism can become a learning opportunity when approached with openness and humility. Eric Clapton turned what could have been an embarrassing confrontation into a masterclass on the difference between judging music and understanding it. And Robert Hayes learned that sometimes the best way to critique art is to first understand what it takes to create it. Sometimes the most powerful response to an attack is not to fight back, but to invite your critic to see the world through your eyes.